Hey, evil villain here, about to go into the Vault of Magic 2 by Sign of Dragon, hoping to steal some magical items, get some access on some new magical spells, and perhaps a new couple of new magical NPCs. Or we could pay $6.95 on the DM's Guild for it. That might be a little easier. So, Vault of Magic 2, what are you getting in this supplement? You're getting 55 pages that contain 72 new magical items, 22 new spells, 4 new NPCs, 6 tables to give you your magic items, some oddities and quirks, 2 new backgrounds, and a load of images across the entire supplement to kind of whet your appetite and give you a good understanding of what these things look like and how they behave, and give your players something to look at when you hand them, say, some axe that's magical, when you can actually say, well, instead of just giving you the axe, just like some random ass axe, you can say, well, I give you the fury of the beast, and here's what it looks like, and that kind of thing. And I like that addition in general. Kind of, that's a really good thing. Now, I want to talk about the magical items in general. You have a plethora of them, and they range from the very common all the way up to the legendary items, and there's a good smattering in between. I think there should probably be a little bit more uncommon magical items rather than the rare, just because that tends to be where the majority of play kind of sits for D&D 5th edition. There are a lot more time spent in those that tier of play, because that's kind of not your very early tier, that's kind of your middle to starting to get into high tier magical items. Things like, in this case, you have the Yo-Yo of Fate, the Ring of Cantrips. Those are some uncommon items. The Ring of Cantrips allows you to cast 2 cantrips from the ring. The Yo-Yo of Fate does some very unusual things in general. So the Yo-Yo has a rarity spanning, and basically has an amount of string, basically, that determines how much and powerful it is. As a reaction, you can make a target that you can see within 30 feet of you have advantage, disadvantage, or disadvantage on an ability check, saving throw, or attack roll. You must choose before the dice are rolled. Each time you use the property line, the Yo-Yo string permanently shortens by 1 inch. When the length of the Yo-Yo string becomes 0 inches, the Yo-Yo vanishes, which I think is a really interesting idea. And the rarity of the item is determined by how much string is left on the Yo-Yo, not anything beyond that, essentially. So the more powerful it is, the better. The more rare it is, the longer the string on the Yo-Yo, essentially. And that's one of the uniquer items in this supplement. And I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like really unique and interesting ideas around how the magical items function and what they do and how they kind of behave. There's things like the Token Sword, which is an uncommon magical item, but it kind of reminds me of, there's a magical item in Xanathar's Guide that's kind of similar, which is a cane that turns into a sword. This is basically a token, looks like a simple pin. So think like, the Harper's pins or things like that, and it turns on a mental command, can turn into a full-size sword for 1 minute and then reverts back to its normal state. So kind of like a really cool assassinal item. I would have sit that more in the common rather than the uncommon variety, especially, and I wouldn't have given an attunement, because this seems it's very minorly powerful in terms of what it's capable of. But one of my favorite magical items in here is the Staff on Striking, not the Staff of Striking. It looks exactly like a Staff of Striking, but it's quite different. The staff is cursed, and on your turn, when you try to activate its power, the staff vibrates a little, and in the air in front of you, a billboard appears, which has the following phrase written in common. This magic is officially on strike. Free the magic items from the slavery of hard, unpaid work. And there's a little blurb that goes along with this, that Hollister Blackcloak himself created this staff to humiliate arrogant adventurers for his own amusement. So if you know who Hollister Blackcloak is, he is the eponymous Mad Mage from the Dungeon of the Mad Mage adventure, and this kind of fits in his theme very well. And there are lots of these little like supplementary kind of additions to some of the magical items. There's things like the Ancient Elven Heritage on the Staff of Miracles, which details its history. And there's some other ones as well, like the Dwarven creation of the Rock Splitters, like how they came to be, which is a pickaxe, essentially, that deals additional damage to structures and items made of stone. So if you're trying to crack your way through a wall, this is really, really useful. It's quite a lot. It's 88 slashing damage from this weapon that does. So you can break your way through a wall very fast with this thing. There are a lot of different things in this for the magical items. Now we move on to magical spells, and these are very in the same kind of theme. They do some interesting things and they behave very interestingly. There are things like just some simple stuff around the Alar's Caress of Death, which is one of the first one of the thing, but I want to talk about it because of the way it works. Your hand becomes ebony black and withered until your next round. Make a melee spell attack against a target that isn't undead. On a successful hit, the target takes 9 necrotic damage, so 2d8. If the undead is targeted by this spell, then it gains 1d8 plus your spellcasting and temporary hit points. So I can see a lot of necromancers taking this to buff up their minions so that they don't die instantaneously, because we all know the skeletons and zombies don't exactly have a huge amount of HP. And there's a lot of really interesting spells in kind of like the way they behave and work in this supplement. But that's one of the sections. The other thing I want to talk about past the spells is the quirks of the magical items. This is similar to if you look in the Dungeons Master's Guide, there is a table for creating magical items that kind of gives you here's a whole bunch of flavor and interesting things you can do. This expands on that and allows you to do some extra things, like give interesting quirks to a thing that have actual mechanical or physical benefits and that kind of thing. So for instance, there's an origin table which doesn't do too much, but it can have some interesting like lore and story implications. But then you move on to things like, well, if you're making, say, let's move on to fun. Let's find one, a good one. A potion, for instance. Like if you say you make a potion and you want to give it a quirk, you roll a d8 table, which is a really small table, but you can say, well, if you roll a 4, after you drink the potion, you become drunk and are poisoned until the effect of the potion ends for 1 minute. And the effect of this is instantaneous. So, and then I want to point out, though, that not all these quirks are positive, not all of them are negative. There's some that are in between, and there's a lot of interesting things around it. For instance, there's a ring quirk that says that if the ring doesn't function while you wear metal armor. So that's a really interesting idea in of itself. Basically, you have to be very specific with these, and maybe your magical items in your campaign have they're kind of a balancing act. You have to give it a quirk as part of its thing in order to function properly, to balance out the universe, so to speak. There's another one for the rods and staffs. So every time, so for instance, this item is invisible, and the item can only be seen by creatures with true sight and can see it. So it would be really interesting. It's like you bump across something, you see something just rolling around on the ground, or you feel something rolling around on the ground. You can hear it, but you can't see this item, and your players pick up an invisible staff or wand and are like, well, what is it? Well, you can't see it, so you don't know what it is until they figure out how to deal with that particular problem. And there's some really interesting, and these tables are really useful for that perspective, but they kind of do remind me of those tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide to let you build unique and interesting magical items. But these are more extreme than that, and these have actual mechanical benefits, whereas most of the ones in the Dungeon Master Guide are things like, it smells of cherries, and was created by some ancient elven deity and used for to protect the elven peoples for a period of time. So it gives a lot of history, but not a lot of quirks and abilities or mechanical benefits. So that's a really neat thing. And finally, you have magical backgrounds, which are 2 new magical backgrounds. Student of Magic, which is kind of like the classic Wizard's Apprentice kind of thing. Very interesting idea around, and I know this is something that comes up a lot. It's like, because the closest one you usually get is Sage. This feels better. This feels closer to what you would want, and it includes all of the usual things, bonds, fawns, ideals, and personality traits, such as characteristics, and features are really interesting around that. You also have Magical Item Scholar, which is a person who is interested in magical items for their own sake. And I think there's a lot of people out there that really like that idea, and I think that's a really good one. Finally, you get a couple of magical NPCs. These 2 are based around the Priests of Mistress and the Priests of Azuth. So there's 4 of them total, and they basically are like a weaker version and a powered up version, and they have unique and interesting abilities based on the fact that they are basically servants of the gods of both magic and I forget what Azuth's other side is wizards, magic and wizards. So, and they can do things like they can give themselves true sight. They can do things like they cast a number of spells. These are basically like priests, wizard priests, essentially. And that's the whole supplement. There's some really new spells, some really new, interesting new magical items, and some new NPCs and some backgrounds and some other things. So that's all like a whole thing around magic itself. Now, what did I like about this? Well, I really like the fact that nearly every page has some amount of art or interest on it to kind of draw your eye to it. There isn't a page where I've looked at something and gone, nope, that I am just reading a wall of text, or there isn't something interesting to grab my eye. Every single page has something on it to kind of at least keep your attention and not have you constantly reading text over and over again. Because as somebody who does a lot of these and reads a lot of these, that is incredibly appreciated, and I understand why it's there. It helps for a lot of people who are visual learners and things like that, because it means that we can attach the words that's being written to something physical and go, okay, that's what that looks like. That's a thing that I can now describe to a player, and not have to kind of go, well, the magic wand is made of ebony and has small ornamental claws at one or both ends, and I can look at the picture and go, that's not how I would describe it personally. I would describe it like this instead. The three rings that are one end is this gnarled black tooth thing, and at the very bottom of it has this what looks like a crystalline claw attached to the bottom of this wand, and it's just like that kind of stuff that allow you to add a little flavor to that. Now, not everyone needs those things, and some people prefer the wall of text, but I generally don't. Another thing I really liked, I liked the additional little blurbs that were in the magical items to say things like, for instance, the token sword has the assassin sword bit, which is like token swords are easily hidden in pockets or disguised as simple pins. And I like those little blurbs, those little bits of lore that say, here's how this thing could potentially be used, here's how it exists in a world, and not necessarily your setting, but it gives you a good stepping stone to see how this magical items, because magical items should be these rare, interesting, and unique things. They aren't sitting in a shop window and just on display. It's not like an MMORPG or anything like that in Dungeons and Dragons most of the time. It can be, but for the most part, I always feel like magical items should have this deep-seated like interest and uniqueness to them. They shouldn't just be the random +1 sword. It should be the sword that slayed the dragon, and by bathing in its blood, it turned into this magical weapon, or it turned into a dragon slaying longsword, for instance, and that's why it was held by the knight who last slayed the great red dragon, Korth, or something like that. And that's some of the stuff that I see here. And I really like that there's a good collection of magical items. Like I said, I would have liked to see more in the uncommon variety. I like that you had an inclusion of both magical items and magical spells, because I think that's something that a lot of DMs kind of lack in. When you're thinking about giving magical items to your players, you tend to give them to the melee and the martial classes, primarily because in terms of choice in leveling up and things like that, there isn't a lot in terms of martials. They don't get a lot of choice leveling up. It's a very narrow path. Whereas the magical classes, they tend to have much more choice in terms of magical spells that they can do. And I think magical items fill that void in a lot of spaces for the martial classes, so you tend to do that. But the thing is that then it feels very one-sided in terms of giving out rewards, and that's why I like having magical items as magical spells, as rewards, because they give an interesting idea, and they give something for the spellcasters out there to work for. So like, you hear about this new spell that you could potentially cast, and you can quest for it, or you can potentially like learn it from somebody out there, and they can tell you how it works and that kind of thing. And that's kind of gives you a reward from the other side of this, I feel, is something that is generally undervalued. And I think that now including them in your game can be tricky, but I think they're worth it. The other thing I really liked was I really did like the tables, the quirks and things like that of the magical items. I thought they were a really neat and interesting idea. I thought that there was, it's a much better expanded version than the Dungeon Master's Guide, because in the Dungeon Master's Guide, they literally have very little mechanical benefit at all, if any. And these add those mechanical interests and different things. And you kind of expected things like potions. Why are all the healing potions exactly the same? Why not them have some of them glow? Why not make them a couple of them stronger? Why not have some of them, well, their origins and the way they're built? Like maybe somebody slipped a bit too much alcohol in one of the potions and get you drunk. It makes a lot of sense from a lot of different ways, is that not every single magical item is gonna be the same in terms of the way they function. There are quirks to them, because you've got to remember that a lot of these things were, especially potions, were created by hundreds of people. It's not like they're all looking at the same formula. They're looking at very different, and the way they construct their potions. And some of the potions, the way they're described, are really weird. Things like all the giant strength potions have toenails in them, for instance. And I get that point, but it's like, is it just the toenail and you could just eat the toenail and that would be enough? But no, it seems like it's a magical process to create them. So do they all share the same recipe? And that doesn't make any sense. And this kind of allows for that that interest there. Moving right along to things I didn't like. There's a couple of things, and I have some notes for this one, because I want to read off on this one, because I think it's important for me to do so, and that way I'm not misrepresenting things that I've written down. I want to make sure that I've gotten these things exactly the way I wanted to, because if I don't do them right, then I think it's disingenuous to the author. So there were a few things where I was looking through, there was a little bit of grammar error, but I know the author and English isn't their first language, so I'm going to send most of this stuff to them to say, hey, these things are a bit wonky, funny, and I'm going to send them a big text document that says, here's the things that I found as a result of that. So if you find them, please do send the author. They're very good at kind of responding and saying, oh, okay, that's how that's supposed to be, we didn't understand that kind of thing. So don't worry too much about that. There were some things that I felt that were, I think the wording on the magical items, they're grammatically correct, but they tend to be things that aren't style correct. So for instance, if you're reading through something and in a magical item and it's written one way in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it may not be written the same way here, but it still makes sense to read it, if you see what I mean. For instance, there's an Axe of Anti-Magic that it says you can cast this spell's magic as a 3rd level spell. Anytime in the Dungeon Master's Guide when you have with things that matter for spell level, there's no need to mention the spell level if it's the lowest level spell. You basically just say you cast the spell, and it's assumed that you cast at the lowest level, because if you were going to say you were going to cast at a higher level, you would have to specify, because Dungeons & Dragons is a game of specificity, so basically exceptions. Unless you say something, there is no exception to it. The other thing I kind of didn't like is there were a lot of things. There were moments within the book when I was reading through that the description of the magical item didn't match the picture that was shown as part of that book. So for instance, the image for the Ring of Quickness does not match the description of the picture that's shown. So it's like the image of the Ring of Quickness needs looking at, as the description does not match the picture. They are very different from each other, because I think the Ring of Quickness essentially says it's a simple silver ring. This thing does not look like a simple silver ring. So if you see the image there, you will see what I mean. And some of the staffs as well, they don't seem to fit thematically with their description and ability. So for instance, when I was talking about the staffs itself, so you have the Staff of Slinging, which is the image is 2 dragons intertwined around this really nice looking staff. But the staff itself says, as an action, you create a large boulder on top of your staff, and then you make a ranged spell attack using your spellcasting ability modifier to hurl it against your target you can see. Now, the staff I imagine for that isn't the staff that the image shows. The Staff of Stunning feels better in terms of the stuff that's got on there, but it also feels like maybe you could have used things like the Staff of Strength for that, or... and the staff on striking is the Wabberjockey from Skyrim, in terms of the image that they've used for that one, which is a pretty good one. Staff of Strength looks really good. It looks kind of like a Klingon Batleth on the end of a pike, essentially, which is good. I think that works really well for the image of strength that I have in my mind. But some of the imagery, some of the images on some of the items aren't exactly perfect, I think, when they match up. I like that there is images there. I think there is a thing there, which is if you're going to use an image, make sure it fits what you're trying to describe. And I tend to do it the other way around. So what I will do is show an image and say, what is the properties of this thing here? What is the properties of this physical object that I'm seeing? I think what's happened is they've worked backwards. They've created this magical item and then worked backwards and created and found an image for this thing. Now when we say found an image, these images are all paid for. I am 100% assured of that. It's a case of you get a bunch of stock art and you kind of just put what you've got, essentially. And it's a good way of getting things together. The other thing is like things I didn't like. I would have liked to see more in terms of those quirks of magical items. I'd love to see larger tables to allow for greater variety in terms of. But then that's kind of like a thing with all tables, is you always want slightly more than you get. I would have loved to see things like treasure generation, or how to include this into existing treasure generations, like which tables they might lie on in the Dungeon Master's Guide, or some way of doing that. Because that's the kind of thing that really makes it easy to incorporate into a game, because with magical items, I always find that if I want to generate a random magical table, the only thing I can do currently is add them to a gigantic Excel spreadsheet and just basically try and pick and choose these magical items. Now, I know what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to just hand pick these magical items, but I always find that if I hand pick things, I'm giving out the same things all the time. I would rather roll on a random table to generate magical items. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. So some kind of way to incorporate those two things. I would have also liked to see, especially for the very rare and legendary items, more information about how they came to be, how they existed, what part of the lore they're fitting into, how they were created. So there are some of this happening. For instance, they're on things like the Mace of Restraining, which is an uncommon rare magical item, but it has a little blurb that says Mace of Restraining are widely used by the watch patrols of many metropolis throughout the multiverse, such as the City Watch of Waterdeep, Flaming Fist of Baldy Gapes, or the Azoria Senate of Ravnica. So it's a really interesting little bit of lore that's attached to this mace. But I would have loved to see, especially for the very rare and the legendary, this incorporated into their blurbs, because it's really important that you understand, especially with these really powerful magical items, how they fit into it, how and why they were created. I know that as Dungeon Masters, we're supposed to kind of create and add our own flavors to them, but having a base starting point is never a bad thing. It gives us good ideas to start from, and we can just throw them away if we don't need them. Right, so on to my final thoughts and my rating. Now, this is a really tricky one because I like what's included here, but I've seen some things that I would have liked to see done better. So I don't think it's a perfect supplement out there. I don't think it's absolutely 100% there. I think that it has some grammar issues that I'm going to send on to the authors to say, here's some issues you can look at. But I don't think that's enough to knock any points off. What I think it is enough to knock some amount of points off is the lack of descriptions, the lack of kind of history and lore behind, especially the more powerful, very rare, and legendary magical items. I would have loved to see more expansion in that regard. These are incredibly powerful weapons. These are things that shape worlds around. I would have loved to see like an expansion in that regard, especially when you're talking about magical items of that power. The reason is that there is so much interest in these things. It's why magical item supplements sell so well on the DM's Guild, because everyone wants new magical items to include in their campaigns. What I think that this one lacks, though, is those magical items that are included. They're interesting mechanically in terms of what they do, but I would have loved to see things that, like, there is a whole page almost for the Hand and Eye of Vecna. There is a whole page for Whelm and Wave and Black Razor. They are steeped in lore and interest and the way they work and how they do things. And speaking of, none of the magical items in this are sentient, which is always an interesting thing in general. Now, do I think this takes off a huge amount of points? No. I think this is, as a magical item book and a nice new little thing you can add into with 22 new spells. I think it's really good. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's some things you could add, like looking at things like like adding lore and adding interest and adding like little bits of flavor and fluff. I know they don't add much to in terms of mechanical things, but I really like that addition. I think it adds so much to it that I think it's worth saying that I'm going to give this a 4.5 out of 5. It's not perfect. That little extra bit, that little extra thing, that 0.5 is what pushes it over the edge. It says this is a thing that if I picked it up as a dungeon master, I would be happy with every single thing in it. I would go, wow, this is a really cool legendary magic item. I can't wait to add this to my campaign. At the moment, I have to think about a lot of different things around this to say, well, how? So this legendary magical item, I have to think, how is this created? What created it? Why did they do it in the first place? Who's looking for it? All of those kinds of things I now have to do a lot of legwork for. Whereas if I at least had a starting point, like with the Hand and Eye of Vecna, or with any of the Book of Vile Darkness, or the Book of Exalted Deeds, I understand how they fit into a world, and then I can go, well, I need to change this and this and this because in my world these things are different. But it would be nice to start somewhere, to start at a point where I can go, okay, I can just change some bits and pieces. So that's why I'm knocking off half a point. It's a small amount, but I think there is enough room for improvement for me to say that's where I'm going to lie. Thank you. This has been DM Please do remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And please do use my affiliate codes, which will be down below, to purchase Vault of Magic 2. It is definitely worth your time. Thank you, and peace out.